So thanks everyone for joining. I'm going to try not to struggle too hard with not getting any audience feedback because that's something that when I give talks in real life, it's really important for me to understand kind of what's going on in the room. We all make it through this. The first thing I want to do is just give a land acknowledgement. So I know we're coming in from all over, but I'm in Seattle, and that's on the historical land of the Duwamish tribe. And so I'm really grateful to be here and presenting. So I can talk a little bit about myself. My name is Sheryl. I have a background in design research and strategy, and I currently work at Substantial, which is an amazing independent design and development consultancy here in Seattle. I'm also a design and public board member and a design educator. And you can see in the image on the right, I really miss the office that I was working out of. I had just started at Substantial in the beginning of February, and I'm actually really grateful that I had a month of time with my colleagues before we were all sent home. Okay, I'm just making sure it's advancing. So some of the things that I do is I teach design practitioners how to engage in systems thinking in their work. And, I've run workshops all over the world with this topic. And I feel really wistful looking at images like this because this is what my work used to look like. And now it looks like this. So I'm kind of adjusting to this new world in which, I'm looking at people's faces on a screen all the time. And that's my desk on the right, which is very different than the big, beautiful, substantial office. And I'm trying to make do with it. I'm sitting there right now. So kind of given this kind of radical change in just like my own working situation, I kind of feel like I'm kind of reeling from the world we found ourselves in just in the past few months. Think about how much the world has changed since March. And this is from the show The Good Place. And for those of you who know this show, in this panel, Michael's saying, okay, shouldn't take long, between an hour and 11 months. Somewhere in there, okay, bye. Don't go outside. And this is kind of how I felt within the first week of working from home. So I think at our work, we went home, I want to say March 5th or during that week sometime. And I remember thinking, oh, Microsoft, they're kind of crazy for saying they're not going to have their employees returning until the beginning of April, because there's no way this is going to last longer than 2 weeks. And this is kind of like how I've felt over the past few months, where it's just kind of like, oh, we really are at home. We really are doing this. It's been 100 days actually since my company started working from home. And we've now added on top of that, basically, children of men in a head spinning amount of time, just the sheer amount of change that we're experiencing, the imagery of our current moment. It's surreal. I feel like it's actually hard to hold all of these things in our minds at the same time. And it's really hard to process. And this is not the timeline that we expected. We didn't expect to be dealing with police curfews and, running out of toilet paper in the grocery store and people protesting in the street. And some of it is just like, I can't believe this is happening. And then some of it is like, yes, it's just super inspiring. And I'm inspired by the collective action that's happening. And I think what we're all dealing with so much change, is that there's a lot of uncertainty. And we as a species are terrible at dealing with the idea of not knowing what's going to happen. And we just have to remember that in this moment, uncertainty is the only certainty there is. This is from mathematician John Allen Paulos. We have no idea what's going to happen. And when that happens, we, not just as people, but as technologists, creators, product designers, there are things that we kind of crave in response to that, uncertainty. One is control, and another is predictability. And I've been thinking about our need for control. And so you see people designing for the things that provide us in control in the unpredictable, in the immediacy of our experiences. And to be honest, we can be quite inventive when it comes to maintaining control. This is in Paris. This is in Germany. You know, some solutions feel kind of absurd, but we can also trust that ingenuity can be, you know, socially acceptable as well, and not just ridiculous. And also accessible and, you know, and effective. And aside from people responding to their own direct and personal experience, we also desire predictability, not just as people, but as creators. And one thing that's I've been thinking a lot about in this moment is, I'm sure all of you have seen future of reports, but you know, there's so many of these out there. This is just about the future of work, by the way. And I've, you know, kind of read some of these over the years. They tend to be just like pretty milquetoast in terms of their technology predictions. None of these seem to mention, you know, a possible global crisis, like say a pandemic. And you know, there are people who've been saying like, we're due for a pandemic, but I feel like we're not inclined to want to think about it. And so we haven't allowed ourselves to think about it. And so we rely on these other mechanisms to help us make predictable the things that we find unpredictable. And I kind of think that to think we can predict the future is hubris. We think that, for example, futurists can help us imagine all these scenarios. And in fact, over the past few years, I've been really pushed in my practice to engage some of the work of futurists. And I've always kind of resisted that. And I was trying to figure out why. And I think this answers some of my reluctance, which is, you know, if you look at futurists or futurologists, you kind of see all our biases on display. And so if you go to Google, this is the first page. This is the second page. This is the third page. This is the fourth page. And I'm like, it's really interesting. We as a society, like we don't even allow like others aside from mostly, you know, middle-aged or older white men to even imagine the future. And so it's really clear to me that oftentimes these practitioners, they're not really focused on inequity or biases. They're focused on technology, and that's the lens they look through. So you find articles like this from 2015, and many of the quotes in here are things like, oh, hey, autonomous vehicles will be everywhere. Corporations will be the same as they are. Everyone will still agree on a neoliberal worldview. And then in this moment, I'm looking around and I'm like, I see a global pandemic. I see political revolution happening. I see people wearing homemade masks that they've literally sewn themselves. I'm just like, this is like a Mad Max moment. Shortages on flour because people are busy making homemade bread. This is just like, is not the future I feel like we predicted. And it makes me think about black swans. The philosopher Bertrand Russell once talked about, you know, what we now call the black swan problem, which is the idea that no one thought black swans existed before someone saw one. And this can also apply to the trajectory of events. If things happen with regularity, we continue to think they'll happen just that way. You know, if you're going to work, you're taking the train, this is like what you're doing regularly. You think the odds of that continuing to happen is what's going to happen. And this makes us less likely to be able to anticipate a crisis that disrupts our previous observations, like say a global pandemic or mass global protests. So thinking back to kind of those technologists, those futurists, they're really following just like the march of technology and accepting the status quo and thinking like you can just build on it. And the truth is we don't know, you know, I, for those of you who've seen my talks before, I've pretty much always used this slide. Our lack of imagination, because it's such a good example of how our lack of imagination is failing us. We fail ourselves by thinking small. We're used to not only designing discrete experiences for the moment, but we're failing also to imagine beyond discrete experiences for our futures. And we're missing the big picture. I love this it's like from an Italian newspaper or magazine from the 60s. Our design work tends to be oriented around, individuals who are using a product in the moment for immediate need. And we think so frequently about experiences directly and not collectively or with consequence. And so one of the things that I was thinking of as I was considering this talk is, while everyone is doing this and responding to their own personal experience, what should we be asking ourselves? We should be asking ourselves, how am I complicit in a system, an organization, a company, a product that could potentially be contributing to making things worse? And so rather than like sharing a bunch of case studies for the things that, I'm working on, or one of the things I wanted to do was kind of think about like, well, what are some principles that I would want to use going forward, as we can kind of think of this as an opportunity to think about our work through a new lens. How might we better equip ourselves as technologists? And how can we get comfortable with not knowing, but to create a foundation of systems, products, organizations that can stand up to crisis? So the first principle I have is to design for resilience. What we're really learning now is that because of the crisis we're in, many of our systems are fragile. So we're talking about our healthcare system, the way our jobs are structured, the way our companies are structured. It's just not creating that sort of safety and certainty that we need in these moments of chaos. I've been thinking a lot about chaos engineering, actually, and this is actually an idea that Stephen had introduced me to when we were talking a couple of years ago. It's basically it's the discipline of experimenting on a system in order to build confidence in the system's capability to withstand turbulent conditions in production. So kind of an example of a system not adhering to that is, I think it was on May 5th or May 6th that a bunch of apps were mysteriously crashing. And it turned out that all of them were integrating a piece of sign-in code from Facebook, which was broken. And therefore everything fell like dominoes, right? Essentially, I'd broken the rules of chaos engineering by relying too heavily in one weak point. So the system was fragile. So as I've been thinking about this and how, things like, Facebook never goes down. Like there are lots of systems that are pretty robust from this perspective. So I was thinking, what if we applied the concept of chaos engineering to the rest of what we're designing, that we can contribute to creating a robust society? I'm wondering how many of you are upset about a local business that has either closed or is likely to not survive this time. This is a picture of Oddfellows, which is right around the corner from where I used to work. It's funny, I describe it as where I used to work because I have no idea when I'll be going back there. But I've been thinking about, how fragile that whole system is. And then on top of that, we have technologies, kind of like technology companies building these platforms, the delivery apps, that have been receiving a lot of criticism during this time. They take upwards of 30% commission per transaction. And for struggling restaurants, the trade-off isn't always clear. And then on top of that, companies like DoorDash lost 450 million last year. So they're not making money. The restaurants are struggling, and maybe the trade-off is that they're getting like more orders through the door, but it's super, super low margins in an already low margin business, and then they're paying these high fees. And so it just feels a little bit like it's a cannibalization of, this network of independent companies that companies like Grubhub and DoorDash rely on. And in fact, I don't remember if it's Grubhub or DoorDash, but one of them, the majority of their business is through independent restaurants and small chains, not the big chains. So this is something for us to think about, just in terms of like, this feels kind of like a vicious cycle. Like, I don't know how this is going to play out, but it just doesn't seem healthy, like a healthy causal loop at the moment. So I was trying to think about, like, have there been good examples of how organizations have responded to the crisis, and sort of the unexpected nature of what's happening. And King Arthur Flour is a 200-year-old company. At the beginning of COVID, they experienced a 600% increase in grocery sales, which is something I've never seen predicted. Like, this idea that, oh, everybody's at home, therefore there's going to be a run on flour and everybody is going to be trying to make sourdough bread. I've been trying to tell people to make sourdough bread now for years. And I'm a big fan of baking it at home. So it's like, that it's having a moment is kind of a trip for me, because I'm just like, what? This is what caused it to happen. Just because, it's like, baking is nurturing, I think, and maybe that's also a response to what we're experiencing, this moment of uncertainty. But anyway, King Arthur Flour is a small company, right? And they did a few things to respond and be flexible, in order to fulfill demand. Their employees were sent home, but they then redirected them to other jobs to help support the demand. They've been helping keep their closed bakery customers afloat by paying them to bake for food banks and donation services. And they did things in their supply chain, like they shifted delivery from train to trucks so that they could get things in the hands of consumers faster, because it wasn't entirely a consumer-driven business before, and now it is. So they had to figure out ways to increase speed, even if it was more expensive. And then they also created new communication channels, such as like baking hotline. They had baking hotline, but they made it more robust, YouTube channel, etc., for customers and new customers. And I think we could learn something from that, especially as big scaled up companies. Like, how can we respond just as quickly? I think in contrast, you look at some like Amazon kind of like fell down like the first week or so after the shutdown. It was just like, it was hard not to think of it as like a broken system, at least immediately. And I think things are back now, but it was kind of like an example of like how quickly things can fail. Another example, and this is more of an example of distribution, is Creatives Tegen Corona, which is based in Antwerp, and it's just like a collective of designers and textile companies, etc., that are connecting distributed people in need. So they produce more than 100,000 personal protective equipment packages through this collaborative effort in Antwerp. And this is a quote from Dries Verbrugghen, who is the co-founder of CTC, and he said, "It was logical not just to focus on production of the finished good, but augment other organizations and other initiatives to also do the work." So their goal was to empower other organizations to do the work. So they made their patterns available, open source, and they also kind of provided organizations such as this company BioRacer that makes speedwear for cyclists with patterns and tools to shift their production to PPE. And it's interesting to just as a response to an immediate need to be able to kind of put this network of resources together in order to create change. And we've seen that here too, in terms of mask production by local people and things like that. So if we're thinking about some prompts, if we're asking ourselves about designing for resilience, and encouraging ourselves to do so, we could ask, how might we respond to demand in a sustainable way? How might we address fragility in our product system? And does my product connect people in a meaningful way to respond to need? And maybe in addition to that, empower people to respond to need. The second principle is designing for equity. I love this quote from Haruki Murakami, where he says, "Between a high solid wall and an egg that breaks against it, I will always stand on the side of the egg." And I've been thinking a lot about this just in terms of equity. Like, how can we as creators, stand on the side of the egg and recognize who is the egg, who's the most vulnerable, and how do we make life better for them. There's been a lot of talk about, you know, making our organizations more diverse, which is super important. And for years, I've been an advocate of that. And I think in addition to that, we who work in technology need to think about how our impact lies in the work we do, in addition to that. So the things you're doing full time, the things that you are building. And if you find yourself kind of working for an organization whose products and services don't serve equity, but in this moment you're kind of like, I care about social justice, I'm donating to social justice organizations. I think it's what we might call charitable side hustle, or what I've heard Anand Giridharadas call it that. And so the harder question for us is to ask ourselves, how are we complicit in systems of inequity? You know, last year I did a systems thinking research project about the impact of Facebook and YouTube, just kind of the biggest social media networks and how they affect society. And it's interesting, just like in the past week, I've been watching Mark Zuckerberg, and he's donating money to social justice causes, but his platform continues to spread disinformation. This chart you're looking at here is just how a single piece of disinformation spreads on Facebook through Facebook groups. And you can kind of see the names of the groups too, just becoming more and more extremist. And so there are several problems at play here: the existence of these extremist groups, the way information gets decimated and prioritized. And so, you know, part of this for me is just considering, well, what we can't just like work on products during the day and think about social justice as our side job. We have to consider, like, are we actually contributing to foundationally to the problems that we're out in the street trying to solve? And, you know, when I think about like some good examples of how companies can behave differently, especially when it comes to things like disinformation, I've always admired Pinterest's stance on some controversial topics. So, for example, you do a search for vaccine, totally innocuous term, by the way. This is a term that is in the dictionary. And they still have to kind of limit their search results. So in this case, you see pins from internationally recognized health organizations, and they're trying to keep the information on their platform evidence-based. And so there are ways to deal with this type of thing. The thing is, you have to make the trade-off of having less traffic, having fewer clicks in order to make the right decision. And if we think again about the delivery economy and equity, you know, many of us are engaged in the systems that are creating this this work environment that fundamentally isn't healthy for a lot of our fellow citizens. This is the quote from the story: "Even in the best of times, gig work offered few protections, but the virus crisis has increased the stakes of operating without a safety net, and most on-demand companies offset thin profit margins by offloading the risk onto workers." On top of that, Black people are more likely to make up those who are deemed essential workers. So a statistic from The Guardian is that 37.7% of Black workers are employed in what we are calling now essential services, compared with 26.9% of white workers. And the disparity increases in healthcare. Black workers are about 50% more likely to work in healthcare and social assistance industry, and 40% more likely to work in hospitals compared with white workers. So this kind of existing punishing inequality becomes more stark in a crisis marked by uncertainty. If we want to think about some examples of systems that have been set up with equity in mind all along, and which are actually serving us in a crisis, We can look at mail-in voting in Washington. So in Washington, we're one of 5 states: Colorado, Hawaii, Oregon, Utah. Those are and Washington are the 5 that have all vote by mail. And this state spent 2 decades working towards making the system work. And on top of that, we've just recently integrated paid postage. So it's about eliminating as many barriers as possible. And you can see that, it's really about making it as accessible as possible. It's the kind of system that confirms that prioritizing equity during good times or healthy times pays off when things go off the rails, like they are now. And all these other states are scrambling to think about voting by mail. In contrast, you think about situations like in Wisconsin recently, or in Georgia just yesterday, where people were in line, there were broken voting machines. And so this is serving us in a crisis because it was designed with equity in mind. It's also probably the lowest, tech analog solutions there could be. It's funny because I was in an accessibility training, sometimes it was like in the past 2 years. And one of the scenarios presented during the workshop was just like, how do we make voting more accessible? And I said, voting by mail is really accessible. And the trainer was really incredulous because it didn't involve any sort of digital technology. And it reminded me that, progress doesn't mean digital technology. Designing for equity could involve low-tech solutions that actually serve our needs best. So that's something for us to consider as technologists. So if we think about what we need to consider when designing for equity, we should ask ourselves, is the work I do complicit in creating toxic systems and culture? Does my product success depend on exploiting people? And I think if, the people who are in your system are striking, they're probably viewing themselves as exploited. And how might we design for the vulnerable? And lastly, I would say, in order to design for uncertainty, we need to think about long-term change. One of my rules of thumb as a practitioner, and those who work with me know this because it can be really irritating, is I'll always question the framing. So I won't make any assumptions about the status quo. I always wonder if every single assumption we're making about things can be changed. So, the systems thinking project that I did last year with Facebook, or not with Facebook, but on Facebook's impact, it kind of exemplifies one of the key aspects of designing for long-term change rather than short-term gain, is really understanding the status quo. So what this kind of mapping allows you to do is better understand cascading effects that exist and better understand root cause. So in the case of these properties, the ad-driven business model combined with the investor-demanded hypergrowth, it creates a vicious cycle, a vicious dynamic in which people's attention is capitalized. And of course, we now see that that's resulted in a toxic and dangerous culture of misinformation. It was Prince's birthday this weekend, and he said this after Freddie Gray was killed by Baltimore police a few years ago. He said, the system is broken. It's going to take the young people to fix it this time, and we need new ideas and new life. And I find that inspiring to kind of think about change just fundamentally. I'm a bit, I'm really passionate about infrastructure in cities, and I think a lot about cycling infrastructure. I lived for several years in the Netherlands, and I really see the flaws in cycling infrastructure in a place like Seattle. What's interesting is in the 60s, there was a plan for Amsterdam to be changed to more of a driving city, where they would have replaced, paved over some of the canals even to build highways, and then big centralized taxi stands to ferry people to and fro. And thankfully, the citizens had enough foresight to shut these changes down and continue having things at a human scale. And that, I'm sure that was really hard at that time because car-centric cities were considered the future. And in fact, they've even gone back, and some of the damage that was done changed it to be more pedestrian and cycling focused. I think there's a relationship between that and what we're going through right now, where you see a lot of roads being closed off for pedestrians in order for us to be able to social distance. You know, several cities have done this. Oakland, Seattle's closed several streets, New York, DC. And part of me is thinking like, okay, this is like a quick term reaction to the crisis, but is this something we can keep, that we can build on? Is this moment of uncertainty, has it provided us with this ability to imagine a different status quo? And so I think there's that saying, I don't remember who said it, but don't waste a good crisis. And I think for things like this, sometimes you see the most interesting solutions come out of moments of crisis. On the flip side, we also need to ensure that we're living in uncertainty, that we don't implement changes that will harm us once the crises are over. So we can ask ourselves if our products are contributing to a set of values that is antithetical to how we want citizens to be treated. I've seen this, you know, because I work in the space of like the unintended consequences of analyzing the unintended consequences of technology and design decisions. I've been really watching with curiosity during the COVID crisis, people's attitudes about surveillance changing, because I think there's starting to be a lot of justification for surveillance in favor of helping us with our public health crisis. And that always kind of gets me a little bit nervous because I'm thinking about how it can be misused. And what's interesting is like almost immediately we're confronted with a situation in which it could be misused, which you're seeing here. So, you know, some police departments were already saying they're going to use contact tracing to kind of help with managing the coronavirus outbreaks as related to the protests. And so it's a good reminder to us, and as NYU media professor Charlton McGillen wrote recently in the MIT Technology Review, he said, it makes you wonder how long it will take for law enforcement to deploy those technologies we first designed to fight COVID-19, to quell the threat that Black people supposedly pose to nation safety. So whenever we're thinking about implementing something from a technological point of view, oh, and by the way, I just learned that today Amazon said that they will not let law enforcement departments use their facial recognition technology for 1 year. So there's always some caveat that makes me question things a little bit, but there you have it. So hopefully the tenor is changing. Recently, in writing about COVID, Yuval Harari said, temporary measures have a nasty habit of outlasting emergencies, especially as there is always a new emergency lurking on the horizon. And I think this is totally true. Like, and it really forces us to ask ourselves, how can what we're developing for the crisis be potentially misused in the future? That's part of how we do long-term thinking well, and not just designing for the short term. As I'm also thinking about long-term thinking, I've kind of been watching what's happening, and I noticed, you know, like when I'm seeing these photos of police kneeling during the protests, I found it kind of distressing. And I think it's because if you really apply systems thinking, these kinds of actions don't address the systemic underlying issues that have gotten us here, the status quo that I'm talking about, nor seem to have an impact on the broader potential change, which is also related to the systems issues, how police unions are structured, for example. So the kind of like kneeling and hugging it out, it just feels like a short-term hit of harmony, you know, without the long-term impact that I feel like I'm looking for from good exercise and understanding how systems are connected. One thing I have really appreciated is I'm like, oh yes, the internet, we are engaging in systems thinking, is this graphic that I've seen shared quite frequently. And, you know, it's interesting that these connections are being made now, which are forcing the issues that allow us to think more meaningfully about long-term change and not just about immediate reaction, even if the fire is lit as something that's happening immediately around us. Making these connections is super important. And so if we think about designing for long-term change, we can ask ourselves, are there ways that I can reframe the problem? Do I have to accept the status quo? Do I have to accept a world that's designed for cars? Do I have to accept a world that fundamentally considers, the way police departments are structured to be the way it has to be? Are we addressing root cause? And am I considering how my solutions might outlive the current moment, good or bad? So we see how in crisis, how uncertainty can help us focus on the right things. And these themes are really interrelated. If we design for equity, we'll create a foundation of resilience. If we design for resilience and equity, we'll create long-term change. And so, I love this quote from Angela Davis. I am no longer accepting the things I cannot change. I'm changing the things I cannot accept. And I'm thinking about this is a moment where we can kind of make those decisions, right? And so we should be part of the change that leads to the world that we want. So thank you. Thanks for listening. I appreciate it. You can find me on LinkedIn and Twitter at Sheryl Cababa, and my company's name is Substantial, and this is their address.
Thanks, Sheryl. That was really great. Thanks so much. There's we're all Zoom clapping. So it's hard in Zoom because it's thanks, Andy. Super powerful, and I think really helpful to us, all of us right now, just trying to process what's going on, trying to live two lives that are going on right now, and sometimes it feels like three lives with all of the attention that's being paid to one topic, and then having to kind of pivot very quickly. And how does that impact society? I think those are really important things for us all to be thinking about now. So I want to invite everybody to use the question and answer feature in Zoom, which is not the chat feature. If you're new to Zoom, it's a wholly separate feature called question and answer, and send in your questions to Sheryl, and we can walk through them. Sheryl, while we're waiting for those questions to come in, what has been on your mind as you have transitioned to your role at Substantial, and what's been going through the minds of the people who you're working with in what comes out of all of this? What are some of the high points and some of the things that are like, we really need to think more about that?
Yeah, I think something I've been happy to kind of notice an increase in is people kind of relating, especially technologists, kind of relating the things that they're creating and designing to the impact it has on the world, and trying and I feel like everyone is trying to understand how to avoid the unintended consequences of their work, but I feel like we still as an industry are pretty ill-equipped to answer those questions effectively, which is why I work a lot in the space of trying to develop tools that technologists can use so that they can ask the right questions, and so that they can kind of more explicitly feel like they're doing the right thing in their work. And I think as we have complex systems that involve AI, I think there's a lot of interest in not allowing ourselves to absolve ourselves of the things that can go wrong with systems like that, and trying to design the right thing up front.
So a couple questions come in. The first one is, What was the mind mapping tool that was used for your Facebook uh,
So
study?
I always disappoint people with this, but basically there are mind mapping tools out there. I can't remember the name of the systems thinking one that I'd used for a little bit. Started with a K, but we had done that in Illustrator, and one of my former colleagues, this brilliant illustrator called Pong Ho, he animated it for us. And so, yeah, unfortunately, it's totally custom. I know that's not a satisfying answer.
Here's one from Alex. Hi, Cheryl. How do you frame up designing a future-proof product, or at least a more future-proof versus a less future-proof product or experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think as you're strategizing about if we think about future proof, meaning like understanding the potential impact of your technology or product, I think some good exercises up front to try and anticipate the potential impact would be really focusing explicitly on cascading effects and sort of what you would call like second order thinking. So it's like I think oftentimes when we're designing, we're thinking about use cases that are directly related to how people use products in the immediate moment. But I think we need to kind of think a couple of steps beyond that to consider the broader societal impact. And so what that means is like start thinking about how people might use products collectively. Think about how bad actors might use your product to do the wrong things. And think about how people will interact with each other. So I realize I forgot to add it in the slide deck, but I try to frame it as I have a framework that is oriented around analyzing the impact on individuals, on communities, and then on society, and kind of thinking about it from what is commonly called steeple, so social, technological, environmental, economic, political. I don't remember. Steep. It could be just steep. But I think those kinds of ways of thinking about your product is really important rather than just kind of solving the technology at hand.
Here's a question from Natalie. I jumped in late, kids' dinner. We know how that is.
Yes,
Really
we do.
hoping there is a replay. Well, there will be a recording up on Products That Count, I think within about a week. And here's a personal question, perhaps more than anything for the group. Sorry, Stephen's reading it now. It feels to me, white women started the work seriously this past fall, that the take a knee as are the equivalent of what I call desk chair activism. I'm as bad as they are, signing petitions, micro donations when a friend starts a GoFundMe. But my deep work has been to try for a career change into systems work. I've spent 2 to 3 years pivoting. I can't figure out how to apprentice. I want to do this work, systems change, and I think I have the brain for it. Any advice? It feels hard to apprentice in this space. I don't think she means Zoom. I think she means in systems.
Yeah. Um, I think I am. This is hard, this is actually hard for me to answer because I don't. Um, I see it being used in spaces that are not necessarily like design and technology companies, but if you look at many social impact organizations, they might not necessarily engage in the systems mapping exercise per se, but they engage in frameworks like theory of change, which are really oriented around the broad impact that you're trying to achieve. And so, not a lot of nonprofits use this, foundations, just a lot of governments, a lot of organizations working in creating creating social impact, and also, yeah, government organizations that have to serve a huge number of diverse people. So I think those are the kinds of organizations where you can really engage in systems thinking, even if it isn't like the systems mapping exercises. Now, I've like I've spent a lot of time in my career just kind of like reinventing what my role is and like the tools that I use. So I would say like if you work in an environment that's game for the idea of using tools like this, go ahead and try to find ways to use it there.
Good advice. Um, here's Natalie. Besides Omidyar Network, who else does the systems change work pretty consistently in a consulting capacity?
Yeah, so a major group like they have really good tools for engaging in systems mapping work, right? And so I would recommend their resources really heavily for people who want to engage in this kind of thinking. Um, I, I I'm not sure I have like a direct answer about who else like I engage in this in a consulting capacity, so I guess you could say it's substantial. Um, I I think it's probably not necessarily like design and technology led organizations, but probably some management consultants engage in this work as well. Um, yeah, I think it comes in many different flavors. There's not like a single approach. It's not like a branded approach or anything like that. So I think it's just like, I hate to say this, but it's kind of like, you know it when you see it.
Got it.
And she's right. Kumu is the systems mapping tool that
Right.
I was referring to earlier.
Here's a question from Matt. Designing the structural change and implementing it are different challenges, especially in a multi-stakeholder environment where interests of status quo may be threatened or stakeholders are at odds, even intrasystem. How do you think about transitioning from design to implementation in such instances?
Yeah,
Great question.
that's an awesome question. I think part of it is that when you're doing the strategic analysis, you are looking at it holistically, right? So it could be that the problem you're trying to solve for. So if you're working on a huge like healthcare system problem, implementation is not going to be, um, it's not necessarily going to take the form of like, okay, now we did this systems thinking project and there's 5 different work streams and we're going to do them. Like, I think what ends up happening is you have a narrowing process as you engage in this kind of work, and then it'll manifest, implementation will manifest in almost like a more, I don't know, detailed, almost tactical way. And that's where you can use kind of like the creative types of problem solving of UX and whatever. I feel like what I found is that good systems thinking exercises can actually dovetail really well into the human-centered design process, which then allows you to articulate solutions from almost like a discrete level, right? Something could be an app. Another thing could be an entire service that's being designed. And so if you think about it that way, then it might be that you have to engage your kind of multidisciplinary intrasystem stakeholders to get buy-in in the right places, but they don't necessarily need to, I don't know, it depending on the point in the process, not all the players need to be informed about everything that's happening necessarily, um, especially if it makes it hard to make the case or build the evidence to be able to do the work.
And that about wraps it up for the hour. So I want to thank Sheryl again for awesome presentation and for keeping it real with us tonight on Products That Count. Thank you, Andy, for hosting us. And thanks everybody for attending. Keep an eye out for a video in about a week. And if you receive a little email from Products That Count, please send in your feedback. We really treasure hearing from people who listen in on these webinars and attend this. And hopefully we'll be back doing this in person at Mixed Panel in Seattle before you know it. But if not, we'll be here usually on the first or second Wednesday of the month. The link for the Facebook group is in the chat if you didn't get it. And thanks again. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Bye, thank you.
Bye,
Thanks,
Sheryl.
everyone.